Good evening. My name is Margarita Mooney. Tonight, we gather as a way of recalling the life and writings of Luigi Giussani. Father Luigi Giussani is well known as the founder of Communion and Liberation and the author of numerous books, including The Religious Sense. But what is less understood about Giussani was how he broke through the conventional opposition between liberalism and traditionalism and proposed Christianity in a way that answers the challenges of modernity to Christian faith. One crucial question for modernity perhaps can be seen as a twist on the perennial question of evil. In the face of so much misery, division, and war, how can the existence of God be justified to man? Giussani responded to this challenge by asking all of us, where do we see God in the midst of our everyday realities? Not just some of them, but all of them. As a person of faith, I have in fact greatly struggled to understand the continuing existence of war, misery, and human suffering, all of which have been the subjects of my own work as a sociologist. So now when I tell people that I teach sociology and theology at Princeton, I get a puzzled look. For those who know that sociology emerged to develop a modern, empirical science of the human good without the need for the transcendent or the eternal, I get questions like, how do those two fields even go together? And how did you end up working in those two disciplines? I answer those questions by saying that I increasingly found myself limited by the vocabulary about human experiences that I found in studying sociology and psychology. So I increasingly read philosophy and theology. When I first read Giussani's books for the first time, only a few years ago, I quickly saw that he had an ability to break through the fragmentation of human experience, so common in modernity, and guide us in the universal desire to ponder our ultimate origins and ends as human beings. The way in which Giussani does this is by calling us to pay close attention to the seemingly disparate events of our lives and immerse ourselves in reality. In that way, we develop a contemplative outlook, where we don't need to dominate nature and control our destiny. Rather, we ponder the unexpected happenings in our lives and savor our special chosenness to have experienced every single moment of reality. In this way, we come to see how all our experiences point us from the reality of each moment to the presence that is always there, animating those moments and reaching out to us. As Giussani wrote, every day we are called to experience this subtle, discrete jolt of resurrection. We have a point of light, a desire to know, an impetus of gratuitous good, a passion for the destiny of men and of things. It is like a projection of love for our own destiny. And within this, slowly, as time passes, all things are embraced and involved until the culmination. How right it would be if the boldness or keenness of this awareness of self and of things that the eternal implies were as vibrant and as intense as they could be. As Giussani expressed in this quote and his other writings, it is in encountering an other we become more fully a person, whereas in pursuing our autonomy, we never feel complete. So often, in trying to be autonomous, we end up depending on other finite human beings, or on substances, or on entertainment to fulfill us. It's our dependence on God that frees us and makes our daily reality full of joyful encounters again. For Giussani, theology was not just a set of abstract ideas. His theology animated his pedagogy as an educator of so many young people, and his vocation as a priest and founder of Communion and Liberation, and his relationship with everyone he met of every background. Tonight, we will first watch a brief video about the life of Father Luigi Giussani, and then we will hear from our two speakers, Father Paolo PROSPERI and Michael Hanby, both professors at the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family. We will conclude with a moderated question and answer session.
The fundamental question for the human person, for any person, in any time until the end of history, ever since the message that God became man was brought, entered the world, the greatest question of life is this. No greater question is conceivable. That is, the human person cannot imagine a greater question for his freedom. Christ, yes or no?
Luigi Giussani was born on October 15, 1922, in the town of Desio, in the Lombardy region of Italy. His father, Beniamino, was an artisan with sympathies for the socialist cause, who passed on to his son a thirst for justice and a passion for reason. From his mother, Angelina, young Luigi received the gift of a deep-seated and well-educated Catholic faith. His love for learning and culture were evident when Luigi entered the seminary at the age of 10. Years later, following his ordination, Father Giussani was assigned to teach theology, but a chance meeting with a group of young people marked a new course in his life. This encounter convinced him that the experience of Christian faith was becoming detached from the experience of daily life and was reaching a crisis point.
And then I left to devote myself, through teaching religion in public schools, to the attempt to communicate religion in a way that would be more easily acceptable to young people. Going up the steps of Berchet High School, I asked myself, what am I coming here to do? I come here to give these kids the opportunity to know what I have known, because why should I have known and felt the reasons, and them not? Then freedom will show the road ahead as it wills. The Lord says, whoever follows me will have eternal life, and 100-fold here below. And I used to say in class, if you do not desire eternal life, I understand you, because you don't have much imagination. But if you do not desire the 100-fold here below, then you are fools.
Though Giussani hadn't planned to start a new church movement, he understood that his charism truly was a continuation of Christ's presence in history, and was thus an answer to contemporary humanity's desire for truth, beauty, justice, and happiness.
We, like everyone else, want a better humanity, but it is not possible for humanity to love better by itself, alone, with only its projects, its fantasies, and its energies. This is what we want to say with the term communion and liberation. It is only the communion that God made possible himself through Christ. It is only in the communion among men who recognize this that, in expanding itself, creates oases of truer humanity.
Father Giussani was filled with wonder as he saw communion and liberation communities spring up across the globe, generating new cultural initiatives and charitable works. CL can now be found in more than 90 countries on every inhabited continent. As the movement grew and matured, Giussani continued to remind its members that their primary task was to acknowledge and announce the fact of God's saving mercy made present in Christ.
Il mistero come misericordia Resta l'ultima parola.
The mystery is mercy, remains the last word, even on all the awful possibilities of history. For this reason, existence expresses itself as ultimate ideal in begging. The real protagonist of history is the beggar. Christ who begs for man's heart, and man's heart that begs for Christ.
Il cuore dell'uomo mendicante di Cristo.
Father Giussani died in February 2005, just days before the passing of his dear friend, Pope John Paul II. At Giussani's funeral, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger captured the essence of this humble Milanese priest, whose passion for Christ had impacted so many. Father Giussani was touched, or better, wounded, by the desire for beauty. He was not satisfied, however, with just any ordinary beauty, with beauty, however banal. He sought rather beauty itself, infinite beauty. And thus, he found Christ.
Now we will welcome our first speaker. Dr. Michael Hanby is a theologian and assistant professor of science and culture at the John Paul II Institute for Studies of Marriage and Family at the Catholic University of America, where he teaches primarily in the theology, biotechnology, and bioethics specialization.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to Angelo and to Crossroads for inviting me here. It's great to be back among friends. I've been treated so well over the years at these events, and I'm really grateful to be here. Can a modern person still reasonably believe in the divinity of Christ? I feel like the answer is supposed to be yes, so I'm going to say no. I'm naughty that way. What's more, while it might be too strong to say that Father Giussani would have answered the question in the same way, I'm also going to say that my meaning accords, or at least mostly accords, with his profound thought, to which I give a yes, but. So let me explain. My answer to this turns on what it means to be modern. Modernity is not just a chronological designation for the era that happens to follow the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the time in which we happen to live. Those who first recognized themselves as modern self-consciously defined themselves over against the ages that preceded them. It was a stance, an act of defiance, a declaration of independence, so to speak. So what was it in declaring themselves modern that they set themselves against? Against the symbolic cosmology of antiquity in the first Christian millennium, a world at once saturated with intrinsic meaning that nevertheless pointed mysteriously beyond itself to its maker, shrouded in luminous darkness. Against the order of universal reason, understood as an attempt to penetrate and contemplate the meaning of nature and being. And ultimately against the God whose word, whose logos, is the creator and measure of all things. The Enlightenment, of course, declared itself to be the age of reason, but its exaltation of reason was always purchased at the price of restricting what reason is and drawing stricter and stricter boundaries around what it could know, lest God and the Church intrude upon the project. Time and again in the history of modern Western thought, reason magnifies its power by restricting its own scope, dumbing the world down precisely in order to authorize our command over it. This project has now reached its telos, which is to say that it has collapsed on itself and on us, who are not simply the protagonists of this project at domination, but its objects as well. Autonomous reason cut off from its transcendent source on one side, and from the symbolic order, an inherently meaningful world on the other side, concludes in its opposite, a technological unreason, incapable of thinking or even asking what anything is, but only how it works. The result is the crisis of truth, now manifest in every facet of modern life and even deep within the church itself. Modern man is capable of believing many things. He may believe that history has an arc. If he is still vaguely religious, he may even believe the arc of history is identical with the work of the Holy Spirit. He may believe that the future is destined to be better than the past, or alternatively, that an apocalypse of our own making awaits us. He may even believe both at once. He may believe he can direct his own evolution through greater technical command of his own nature. He may believe that all things are possible, or he may despair that nothing ever really seems to happen. And here again, he may even believe both at the same time, as he is no longer bound by the law of non-contradiction. He may believe that a man can really be a woman, or what amounts to the same thing, that there really is no such thing as man and woman as we have heretofore understood them. Modern man can believe any number of things without really thinking about any of them. He may even believe in any number of Christs. But he cannot reasonably believe anything insofar as he is modern, nor in the Christ who is the divine Logos of the Father, in whom all things were made. Because to be modern, to identify as modern, is to have reduced reason to its technical application, to have reduced the world to a meaningless receptacle of the technical will and truth to technological possibility, to have identified our knowledge of this world with the control we can exert over it. To be modern is to be one for whom the elves have always already sailed west, to inhabit a world reduced, in Father Giussani's words, to the level of things, flattened, two-dimensional surfaces, transparent to this or that kind of empiricism. Except that according to this logic, there ultimately are no real things, no given natures, no abiding identities with inherent meaning, interior depth, and the weight of being. Only collections and series of manipulable historical processes, facts to be analyzed, and problems to be solved. I therefore concur with the clear implication of John Paul II's Fides et Ratio, that faith is ultimately required to sustain a commitment to reason, though this brings with it a certain less frequently observed corollary. We can judge the quality of the faith, its adequacy to the divinity of Christ and the Logos in whom we were created, by the quality of the reason it inspires, its scope and depth, its capacity to sound the depths of being and to take all thought captive to Christ. By this measure, the pious atheism that prevails in so much of the church today, in the sociology, psychology, politics, and journalism elevated to the place once occupied by theology and philosophy, manifests a profound crisis of both faith and reason, each made worse by the other. The question, then, is not so much whether modern man can reasonably believe in Christ, as whether Christ can restore modern man, which includes the modern Christian, to the fullness of his reason. The answer to this question is surely yes, for modern man is man before he is modern, more truly man than modern, and perhaps no fully modern man, thankfully, exists. Modernity may stupefy, but it does not satisfy. There is, as Father Giussani says, something even in the heart of modern man that corresponds to the mystery of Christ, that longs for it, even though, as modern, he no longer recognizes what he desires and thus no longer recognizes himself, and even though the desire for the infinite is easily perverted in ways that are terribly destructive. The awakening of man from his modern stupor and the restoration of his reason therefore surely depend upon his encountering truth as an event. As Father Giussani says, quote, something unpredictable, unforeseen, not a consequence of previous factors, end quote, that brings him back to his senses, as it were. The event in which we encounter Christ in the mysterious depths of reality, this event that opens our eyes, can, of course, take many concrete forms in the course of our lives. A great personal or civilizational tragedy, an act of real humanity and love, an encounter with great beauty, which always pierces and wounds the soul, opening it to receive. And yet I want to suggest, I hope, more as a clarification of Father Giussani's idea than a correction of it, that the Christian encounter can only be a totalizing event in the way that he proposes, one that integrates the whole of his subjectivity with the whole of objective being and history as he is able to apprehend them. If the nature of event is paradoxical or analogical, such that it is not simply unpredictable, unforeseen, and not a consequence of previous factors, but at the same time and for the same reason, the fulfillment of those factors which somehow anticipated it, as the new covenant fulfills and completes the old, which made straight its path. In other words, truth, the truth of God, the truth of being, the truth of ourselves, the truth of Christianity, is not simply a surprise which interrupts and imposes itself amidst the banal realities of every day. Truth, reality to the modern man, is also like the blade of grass which struggles to grow between the cracks in the sidewalk, and which we pass by in the banal reality of the everyday without even noticing it. The event unites the surprise of becoming or the drama of a happening with the quiet stillness of being that precedes my entry into it or my awareness of it. This is implied by the very notion of correspondence. If the event weren't continuous as well as discontinuous, if it were not anticipated in some way, it could not be an event for me, but only could be an act of violence done to me. Like all truths, this one is risky. Dangerous consequences follow both for individuals and for religious movements if the rich paradox of givenness, anticipation, and surprise is dissolved in either direction. Dissolve the dramatic structure of the event into the simple givenness of truth, and the event of truth will have no new word to speak, no word of life, in circumstances that are unprecedented in their very nature as circumstances. The result is the dominance of a traditionalism, a rule-bound Pharisaism, as Father Giussani suggests, devoid of spirit and life, incapable of rendering the whole of my being or apprehending the meaning of the moment, the mystery reduced to a collection of rules. But dissolve the paradox in the other direction, resolve it exclusively in favor of the unprecedented, the unpredictable, and the unforeseen, and the result is a presentism, cut off from the historical gift of faith which mediates the event and makes it meaningful to us, isolated from the communio personarum, transcending time and space, and ultimately inadequate to the fullness of the truth beyond my subjectivity to which the event is an awakening. The two stances are ultimately not so different. Each represents a perennial temptation for religious orders and movements, the temptation of the branch to mistake itself for the tree, to see its founders or patrons not simply as exemplary figures in the vast sea of the tradition, but as the summa of the tradition. Thomists are often accused of this, Jesuits too, though it is certainly not how St. Thomas and St. Ignatius would have thought of themselves. Or to see the movement not as possessing one charism or one mission in a church spanning the ages, but as identical with the church itself. This temptation is particularly acute in modernity, where we perpetually define ourselves in opposition to previous generations, and in our particular moment in ecclesial history, where we are perpetually invited or bludgeoned into equating the Holy Spirit with the spirit of the age. Let us take a remark of Father Giussani's, one which admittedly makes me a little nervous, as an occasion for thinking further about this temptation. The event, he says, is the only category capable of defining what Christianity is. We have never spoken of Christianity except as an event. It cannot be spoken of except as an event. Now, I appreciate the depth of this effort to break open the profound inner core of Christian experience. But then one wants to ask, what was Christianity then before we learned to speak this way? And did the generations upon generations of Christians who did not think this category so fundamental not understand themselves? I trust you see the difficulty. Read properly, and no doubt in the way that Father Giussani intended it, the language of event is understood as a way particularly apt in this time of suffocating and enforced superficiality, of penetrating more deeply the dramatic experience of living faith at the heart of all true Christianity. Misinterpreted, however, and such misinterpretations usually take the form of an unreflective assumption rather than a self-conscious position. Such a comment could be taken to mean that Christianity has only fully arrived with us and with our ability to see and think this way. This pervasive assumption takes many forms in modern Christianity. We see it every day. It is the very essence of the modern, ungratefully negating that upon which its own life depends and depriving itself of the capacity to see beyond its own horizons. It takes precisely the openness to reality for which Father Giussani pleaded, a profound gratitude in what Joseph Ratzinger called ontological humility, as opposed to merely moralistic humility, to avoid succumbing to this temptation, especially in this historical moment. St. Augustine profoundly and famously praised God and his beauty as ever ancient, ever new. The one who is both, because his eternity is the selfsame, while our existence is fleeting. The event that brings us face to face with this mystery must likewise be ever ancient, ever new. New because it addresses us, each of whom enact a life and occupy a perspective in the cosmos that is never to be repeated. Ancient because we unfold this life as a gift from those who preceded us in the faith, in the presence of the eternal one whose knowledge into the depths of his creatures is the cause, truth, and measure of all things. Only when we begin to perceive this and to see everything in light of this, only when we can once again begin to view our present in light of the eternal, can modern man be said to have a reasonable belief in the divinity of Christ. And only when he has a reasonable belief in the divinity of Christ can he be said once again to have full use of his reason, to understand himself and the signs of the times. That this too was the position of Father Giussani, I infer from these remarks of his with which I will close. Quote, over every instant looms the weight of the eternal, said the poetess Ada Negri, who converted because of this discovery. The affirmation of the boundless, eternal, infinite value of even the tiniest instant a man might imagine is, in fact, proof of the divine, the gift of the Spirit. There can be no such affirmation except in a divine conception. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hanby. We now welcome Father Paolo Prosperi. Reverend Prosperi joined the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family at the Catholic University of America in January 2011, bringing his expertise in the Greek Fathers as well as in scriptural symbolism and typology.
I'm glad to be here also because there was an unforeseen event on the way. My tire exploded, so I had an experience of what the event is, although not a very pleasing one. But I'm very thankful that I'm here and I can be here with you. And also, first of all, I also thank wholeheartedly the responsibles of the Crossroads Cultural Center for giving me this opportunity. It's an honor for me to be given this opportunity, and it's paying a debt, first of all, to the memory of Father Giussani, to whom I owe everything in terms of my faith, but also in terms of my vocation. So I'm very glad to be given this occasion. The topic is the relationship of Giussani to modernity, and of course, after having listened to my friend Mike, who is not a member of CL, but we are constantly in conversation, I guess my task is more to try a little bit in a very telegraphic way, because it's impossible in 20 minutes to condense really the richness of Giussani's approach to what I would say, the interesting distinction of Mike, the modern man, even more than modernity, because modernity is an abstraction. For Father Giussani, only human beings, concrete human beings, exist. And I will come back to this. No? So in the first part of my talk, I will a little bit try to sketch a couple of points that I consider central in Giussani's relation to modernity. And in the last point, I will try to, very telegraphic way, to address the question of what is the event for Giussani. Also probably trying to a little bit respond to my concern. Then maybe we can have a conversation. So Father Giussani loved to use a quote of Cornelio Fabro, the famous philosopher, when he wanted to embrace in a nutshell the core of the modern way of seeing reality. Mike also spoke a lot about this. If God exists, he doesn't matter. In other words, for Giussani, what is most dramatic about modernity is not in the first place that the modern man lost faith in the God of Jesus Christ, although it can be cursorily true, but he sees the world, reality, as apart from God, or etsi God non daretur. It doesn't matter. If God doesn't exist, it doesn't make any change in my way of seeing. Again, to quote a famous friend of his, then Cardinal Ratzinger, and now Pope Emeritus Benedict, the man of today is stuck with positivism, and thus in despair, close to God and to the question of God. It is as if, I still quote, the organs, the senses, and other key words in Giussani's vocabulary, through which by nature man is given to perceive the presence of God, of the mystery, within this reality that my eyes see, that my hands touch, were severely atrophied. We can speak in the sense of a crisis of the senses, or to quote the title of Giussani's most famous book, a crisis of the religious sense, which is not a sixth sense besides the other five, but rather the power to use all of our perceptive faculties to the full extent of their potential, so to speak. The religious sense is the power to see the flower as a sign of the infinite mystery, as we read and heard over and over again through the eyes full of wonder of Father Giussani when he would speak about this. It's the power to hear in reality, in daily reality, the voice of the mystery who speaks it. In a nutshell, the core of the problem of modernity is for Father Giussani the reduction of reason. I'm very glad that Mike also brought it up, this expression, that it seems to me encapsulates the problem. I think this expression is key also because it shows the provocative element of Giussani's take on modernity. Not an overemphasis on reason. For example, too much reason versus too little faith. But rather its reduction, which means, again, challenge, disempowerment of reason. Therefore, too little reason. Not so much too much power to man, but in a sense, too little power to man, where obviously the core of the problem lies in what we mean by power. I will come back later to this. Here I want just to stress that for Father Giussani never starts by emphasizing the misery of man. his brokenness, his sinfulness, although he's very aware of all that. But rather man's call to greatness. Let's even say power, rightly understood. From this perspective, I think we can say Father Giussani fully empathizes with a key dimension of the modern spirit, although that dimension that modernity unconsciously inherited from Christianity, by the way, man is the greatest thing in the created universe. The idea of the infinite dignity of the human person. In other words, Giussani empathizes with the modern emphasis on human aspiration to greatness. While he sees in most of the modern trends of ideologies, etc., a tragic reduction of what this greatness is, and therefore the betrayal of its own aspiration. And so I come to my second point. What time did I start? 7:40? Okay. Leopardi as a friend. I think there is no better exemplification of Giussani's relation to the modern man, a relation I would capture through this expression as empathically critical, or critically empathic, that keeps together this aspect of, identification, because we are modern. There is nothing to do. No, we can talk about this later. But also critical. But a criticism that wants to be born from within. His father Giussani's friendship, he used to call it this way, with one of the most extraordinary figures of Italian modern literature, Giacomo Leopardi. Don't worry, we don't need to know everything about who Leopardi is in order to understand Giussani. It's not the case. But what I'm claiming is rather that this friendship helps us to understand, as probably the best paradigm, this fascinating relationship of Father Giussani with modernity. First, who is Leopardi? Leopardi, in a nutshell, for those who don't know, maybe all of you already know, I don't know, but it's not American, so let me say two words. Leopardi is a philosopher, granted not a great one as philosopher, and a poet. It's both, and that's what makes him a kind of unique figure, an outstanding one, who lived in the first half of the 19th century, that is immediately after the end of the great century of the Enlightenment. And as a philosopher, he's totally entrenched in the sensualism of French Enlightenment. He has read also a little bit of Locke, your friend, by the way. But as a poet, he's not. So there is this sort of contradiction within his spirit. His experience of reality breaks the boundaries of his ideas. His heart, in front of beauty, especially of the beauty of the woman, vibrates no less than the heart of a Dante vibrated in front of his Beatrice. I hope everybody, at least a little bit, is familiar with this. With what I mean, the comparison is illuminating, because for Dante, man of the Middle Age, the beauty of the woman was like a window into the divine. In piercing the eyes, created beauty awakens the memory of God and thus becomes a way to Him. That is what Giussani has always called experience of reality as sign. Leopardi, in front of the beautiful face of a woman, experiences the very same sublime feeling, sublime elation of Dante. But he calls this feeling delusion, dream, naive illusion of the youth. And that measures the difference. The modern Enlightenment, which is for Leopardi the adult age of humanity, has taken away that shade of mystery that endowed all things in the pre-modern age. But this is the irony. Deprived of their shade, of their mysteriousness, of the nocturne dimension, things, faces, all of reality loses at the same time all their splendor. What remains is a flat, shallow, empty mass of stuff. to be used for what? It's never fully clear. Deprived of any intrinsic meaning. I could quote, what time is it? So youth fades out. The shadows, this is from a poem that is called sorry, I don't remember, the going down of the moon. The light of the moon for him is the best, because moon, it's a light, but at the same time, he preserves this shadow, this mystery in reality. The shadows and the shapes of glad illusions flee, and distant hopes that prop our nature up give way. Life is forlorn, lightless. Looking ahead, the wayward traveler searches for goal or reason. On the long road, he senses lies ahead, and senses that man's home truly has become alien to him. Man's home has become alien to him. So the loss of the world, not of God, but of the world. This tragic contradiction between Leopardi's heart, between his experience of beauty and his reduced understanding of reason, becomes for Giussani, though, a paradoxical sign of hope. No matter how entrenched men and women are in scientism and in technological world, the heart of every man and woman still longs for the truth, for beauty with capital B. There is one poem of Leopardi in particular that Father Giussani loved more than any other, to the point that he used to mentally quote this poem when he would receive the Eucharist, because for him was the best possible poetic expression of the longing of the heart of man for Christ, for the incarnated beauty. And it's called Alla sua donna, to his lady. It was a tribute, I'm quoting Giussani, it was a tribute not to one of his lovers, but to a discovery he unexpectedly made. Leopardi unexpectedly made. What he was looking for in the woman he loved was something beyond her, which revealed and communicated itself in her, but was beyond her. And so I come to the last point of this section on Leopardi, the second point on this section of Leopardi. If what we said is true, the important consequence is for Father Giussani, as in a certain sense for his friend atheist Leopardi, a world without God, a world deprived of its relation with the divine, is a world reduced to nothing. Deprived of its infinite depth, it's precisely the face of the woman that disappears, that evaporates. It's reduced to a thing to use. We come in this way to see the core of Giussani's modernity as I see it. If the turn of modernity is about humanism, is about liberating the full potential of man in mastering and enjoying this world, then Giussani's answer, in a nutshell, could sound, well, without Christ, this is precisely what you lose. The taste, the full taste of this world, and this is exactly what we heard about in the video, the centrality for Father Giussani's way of proposing Christianity of the evangelical concept of the 100-fold. No, if you don't want eternal life, okay, I understand you, but if you don't want the 100-fold, then you are a fool. What Christ promises is not only life eternal, but the 100-fold, a fuller life here and now. A fuller enjoyment of the realities of this world. And I would, as an example, but okay, I still have at least 5 minutes. Six. Okay, 6. Okay, so just let me give this famous example. I mean, he meets by chance on the train. Many of you are already familiar with it, but to me it's the perfect example, no, of what that means. No, he meets this sort of ex-friend, an ex-seminarian who was in the seminary with him, a very particularly skeptical, cynical temperament. He left the seminary because he fell in love and he got married. And Father Giussani, encountering him, makes this joke. I had told you that when you would fall in love, all your cynicism would evaporate. And his friend said, you were right, Father Giussani. No? But then, at a certain point, he looks at him in the eyes and says, well, not fully. Because still, it's true, I love my wife, but there are these moments in which when I look at her in the face, I want to laugh. I want to laugh because I feel I'm lying. And I wonder, is it all Is it everything? Is this everything? No. How can I be honestly keep telling myself I will love this woman for my entire life? And Father Giussani answered saying, yes, you're right. But just try to imagine if when you look at your wife in the eyes, just the surface of her eyes becomes the starting point of a journey into the depth that travels through the stars of the entire universe and get to the source where the face of your wife springs forth, that infinite source who is giving her to you now. If you see that, then you will be able to love her for your entire life. No. So the encounter with Christ is then for Giussani precisely that event through which the interior senses of man are reawakened, and he becomes anew able to see reality in its true splendor, and so to enjoy the looking at the face of the woman and at the stars, enjoying this seeing 100-fold. And so I come to my last point in 3 minutes, which is, the third point is back to wonder. Back to the Wonder, which is also the title of a famous movie. Not really famous, but a beautiful movie of Terrence Malick, but doesn't matter. With this, although we can talk about this later if you want. With this, we have already introduced the answer, it seems to me, to the most urgent question: how to reawaken or re-educate, which is the mission to which Father Giussani consecrated his entire life. That religious sense that in contemporary man is so atrophied. And it seems to me the answer of Father Giussani is very simple, through the event of an exceptional encounter, the encounter with Christ, God made flesh. And of course, what this means or can mean should be unfolded, so I have no time. So, but I want to say only the central point. So the human eye, says Giussani in the text that also Mike was quoting, is reborn through the experience of the encounter I would qualify with the beauty of Christ. Father Giussani has always given this definition that is classical, but is very important for understanding what he means by beauty: splendor of the truth. Splendor of this visibility of this invisible reality, this mystery that is inside. So it's an experience of navigation, of penetration. So the human eye is reborn to the experience of the encounter with the beauty of Christ, with the man in flesh and blood, in the eyes of whom the mystery of God becomes transparent. The truth becomes transparent through an experience, as always said Father Giussani. Becomes transparent through an experience, through an encounter. Perceivable in such a luminous way that one is conquered even before starting to fully understand why. This is not a giving up the importance of understanding, but Giussani calls this experience correspondence. And here I want to make a final qualification in this last minute and a half. In response to my friend Mike Hanby's important challenge when he was emphasizing the need for a paradoxical, he called it this way, understanding of event. I'm going to try to say what this paradoxicality means for Father Giussani. Actually, it's precisely those exercises that, in a certain sense, through which, when I experienced my vocation, that he spoke about this. So it's a very dear concept to me. The event of Christ is for Giussani something unforeseeable, yes. Something unimaginable by me in advance, yes. And yet something that resonates with me, with everything I am. Correspondence. With my heart as nothing else before. When I'm put in front of it. Something, therefore, I can recognize. Even if and because I have never seen anything like that. I can recognize it because, somewhat unconsciously, I was always already waiting for such a beauty as Leopardi was longing for it. So it's both unexpected and yet longed for, and thus easily recognizable. Just a memory, personal memory, on this key point to conclude. And this is one of those agrafa, no? Unwritten anecdotes, because I was lucky, so I also, for 1 year, I had the possibility of seeing him once in a while. And so sometimes these memories pop up. And I remember I asked a similar question to Father Giussani once, because we were doing School of Community, so-called, on this point, on this question. And he, knowing about my passion for music, answered to me using the following analogy. Could you ever imagine that something like the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven, before listening to it, could exist? And I said, no. And yet, when you heard it, you loved it. And I said, yes. Can we say you felt a correspondence, as if that music resonated with you and was somehow a real revelation, even of you to yourself, of what your hearing is made for? And I said, yes. The same is with Christ. I couldn't imagine him before encountering him, and yet I recognize him infallibly when I meet him. And at the same time, I start to better understand myself, who I truly am. It's like when you listen to the Fifth of Beethoven for the first time and you feel pierced. In a sense, it is as if you realized for the first time what your hearing is capable of, the full potential I was talking about before. It is as if you knew yourself, the potential of your hearing, for the first time. Without the particular encounter, without the historical event in time and space, with that experience of beauty, you can't know what your hearing is, what is made for, what kind of sublime realities is your hearing able to put you in touch with, just by capturing sounds. The same with Christ. Only in front of him you realize who you truly are, what your eyes and ears and heart is made for. This then is why the encounter with Christ is surprising, elicits wonder for Giussani, not only because it's totally unforeseen. This could leave me perfectly indifferent or actually bother me. It is surprising because it corresponds to my longing as nothing else before. That's it.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for those excellent presentations, and also thank you to both of you for sticking to the time limits I gave you so meticulously, because that leaves a lot of time now for conversation and question and answer. I have a few questions for you, and then after we've had a bit of conversation, I'll be happy to open it up to the audience. I'll start with Professor Hanby. If I understood kind of perhaps the heart of your argument was in this one sentence, or the way that you answer this question, can modern man believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ? I thought it was very striking when you said, modern man can believe any number of things if he's not thinking, but he can't believe anything if he's really modern. And then you went on to say, that faith is actually required to sustain reason, at least as you understand it yourself as a believer. Then you finally kind of turned your talk and said, well, modern man can believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ, but essentially because Christ comes to save modern man, and that modern man desires Christ even if he doesn't know it. So I wondered if you could perhaps expand a little bit more on that, because it just sounds like if people don't know they're looking for Christ, how are they going to find it, right? So what does this actually look like? You said it happens in an encounter, but can you say more? How does someone who doesn't know he's looking for Christ find him?
Well, he gets found, for one thing. But let me back up just a little bit and maybe clarify part of that. And this is where what I was saying, I think, really dovetails with what Father Paolo was saying. When I compared truth to the blade of grass that grows between the sidewalk, between the cracks in the sidewalk, the sidewalk is, in a certain sense, the reduction that we impose upon reality through this reduced sense of things, through this reduced sense of reason. But the violence we do to reality doesn't eliminate reality, and it continues to, I want to say avenge itself, but of course that's, I don't want to make it, but it continues to offer itself to us as beauty, as grace, as truly human gestures. And because we are creatures, because the human heart being what it is, even in our lostness, there is always, precisely as Father Prosperi suggested, this correspondence between reality and what we were created to be, and it surprises us. This idea that Joseph Ratzinger mentioned, I believe, in the homily that he gave at Father Giussani's funeral about beauty wounding. I mean, I used the same image. Everyone has an experience of that. And, you know, Christ finds us precisely through those kinds of experiences which reorient everything. I don't dispute that dimension of I don't dispute Father Giussani's thought. I mean, my challenge in a certain sense wasn't so much a critique as an attempt to clarify what an event, or at least raise the question about what an event must be for it to have this power. But all of those engagements with the real have the capacity to mediate and to begin to make present to us, you know, he who created the real. Because in itself and in reality, things are signs in their richness. They point beyond themselves to God.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Father Paolo, I wanted to ask you to elaborate a bit on your talk, but perhaps a little bit in light of how you met Father Giussani, because you began your talk by saying that you owe your faith to him, and in particular, you owe your vocation to him. And so, as I mentioned in my brief introductory comments, there were a few ideas from Giussani's writings that really attracted me and made me want to read more and learn more. And what I picked up in your talk was the terms that you kept coming back to, the concepts that you kept coming back to, were the concepts about beauty and the desire for the infinite and the hundredfold. And I'm just wondering, you know, if you could tell us even just a little bit biographically about how you encountered the movement, how you encountered Father Giussani, and were these the ideas, or what were the ideas or the concepts or the things that made you want to keep coming back? Because it seems like you were coming back a lot to this idea of beauty and the hundredfold, and the idea of beauty leading us to see reality as a sign.
This is a dangerous question. No, in the sense that yesterday I had a dinner and with some friends, and someone asked me a similar question. I mean, I spoke 1 hour and a half, so.
We're almost late today.
No, but I want to keep it short. So, no, I mean, this is what is dearest to me in my life. So it's really, but it's very interesting because having to be short, I also have to select what is most. No? So if you ask me, so let's qualify the question. There are different questions. So if you ask me what struck me the most in Father Giussani as a person, but also, okay, and I think it's not the answer I'm going to give is not a sentimental one, although there is a lot of feeling involved. But it gets to the core of what I was trying to say. In other words, first of all, Giussani was not a man who would speak about wonder. Giussani was a man in wonder. So, and that's what that's what made him speaking about wonder so persuasive. In other words, if I have to tell you, I'm sure that everybody who met him had exactly the same experience, so I don't claim any extraordinary privilege in this sense, but what would strike you immediately in encountering him was that he was in wonder in front of you, right? I mean, it's this perception that somehow he was seeing something unique and uniquely precious in front of these eyes full of almost of water, right? I mean, if you see that there is this almost on the edge of crying all the time, no? I mean, and it was not fake. And you would have this perception. So, but then in time, deepening his thoughts, following him, I realized that was not just this sort of simply this exceptional charisma that was given to him, period, although it was also that. I think it was a gift of the Holy Spirit. But in that sense, I see the modernity of Giussani. In sense, he's living person, the witness to what can be seeing reality in a certain way, no? It seems to me it was a gift to the church, precisely his way of seeing. In other words, this reason that it's so recovered and not to its original purity. He was really able, I mean, he was given to, once he answered to the question, why can't we love as you do? We don't have the same passion. And he answered, that's not the problem. The problem is not that you don't have my same affection or charity, but the problem is that you don't see what I see. No, in other words. And there is in the 10th chapter of the Religious Sense this passage, this famous example, so simple, but I think in a nutshell contains everything, no? About the fulfillment of what Mike was talking about. In other words, Christ restoring reason to its full potential. And he makes this point in order to try to describe phenomenologically almost, what would it be the original experience of man in encountering reality if reason were, what it should be. And he has always said, imagine to be born now, no, with the awareness you have now. In other words, to have the awareness of an adult, 20, 25, 30 years old, and to be thrown into reality now. And he would say, what would it be your first response? Wonder in front of the fact that reality is there, is given, appears, gives itself. This not grantedness of reality, no? And in a certain sense, the event for Christ, for Giussani, became this window, this center of an earthquake that expanded in his perception, not only of Christ, but of the whole of reality as event. It is in its givenness, which is what actually reality originally is, this gift. No? And in fact, he always, the last thing, I always remember that quote that he over and over again repeats when he narrates this overturning moment in his life in the seminary when he realized what the incarnation was, no? that the word became flesh. And he says, from that moment, not even a single, again back to Mike's point, nothing was banal anymore for me, nothing. So it's not only the person of Christ, but it sort of radiates this experience and illuminates everything. Because everything, only also the little piece of grass becomes the sign of the infinite. No. So.
Well, I have another question that I wanted to ask both of you to comment on. You in your answer talked about how Father Giussani was a man who didn't just talk about wonder, but who exuded kind of a look of wonder. And, I have to say, as I mentioned in my earlier comments, I'm quite new to Giussani. It was only 4 years ago or so where my cousin, who had become a Franciscan sister of the Renewal, I was corresponding with her about my own work, as I mentioned, in sociology. And I had actually intentionally set out to interview people who said they didn't believe in God and ask them about their experiences of suffering. I don't know what I expected, but I didn't find people people who were philosophically materialist or atheist. I kept encountering people who had this vocabulary of an experience of the transcendent, even though on these sociology surveys we had done with those same people, they said that they weren't sure they believed in God or had never attended church. But people had these powerful experiences of a transcendent presence breaking in to their life. And I thought, this is so strange. This is not at all what I expected. Then I go back to teaching my students. I was at Yale at the time, and I find all of these, highly educated, well-qualified students, and I start a reading group on happiness. And again, find all of these students who may not believe in God or have never been into church, but are looking for something deeper than their resumes or their achievements, And one student even told me that when he went to a evangelical Christian Friday night music, that he just felt in this music that there was something other there than just human beings. But my wonder, so my cousin tells me, I'm telling her these stories, and she says, well, you should read Giussani in the religious sense. And so I started reading this book, and as I mentioned, before the program start, I was really, I would say, troubled by his repetitive use of these words, experience and event and encounter, the 3 E's, right? And here I am, I'm dropped into some, school of community where you're supposed to talk about 2 pages of text, and I have about 29 pages of questions for each page. And, fortunately, actually they thought I would never come back. And instead, they just kept giving me more things to read. And at the time, I was also teaching graduate students in the philosophy of social science, trying to get people with PhDs in sociology to care about philosophy and metaphysics, because I had become really persuaded that the language of sociology was so modern that it actually lacked a vocabulary to talk about the very people whose experiences we were trying to understand. So that's a long-winded way of saying that kind of what drew me to even undertake reading the Religious Sense and other works by Giussani was that I sensed that there was something profound, but also very different in how he uses these terms, encounter, and experience, and event. And yet, it also seems that those very words are crucial to how both of you answered the question tonight. Can a modern person believe in the divinity of Christ? And if I understood both of you to say, well, only because of an encounter, only because of an event, only because of an experience. And so I'll just repose my question. Can you say a little bit more? What is this? What is this event? How do we know that this event is happening or that this encounter is happening? And
well, the fact that Mike, despite his greater wisdom, gave me the word makes me honored. So, well, it seems to me there are 2 different questions in your question. There is the question about why this emphasis on the experience, and there is a question, so what is this event? I guess what you are, if I correctly understand, how are the 2 things connected and why are they both, in a certain sense, interconnectedly essential for Father Giussani, and I agree with you. Yeah, we could talk for hours and we've been making the theory there, but I just want to give you an example this time around from my experience, because I'm also a priest and I'm not only a professor, so I also, hang out with kids, etc. So, and also kids of CL, no? So, and it's very interesting. So, a student of mine who is now in CL, 3 years ago, and he always tells this story publicly because it was sort of life-changing for him. So I'm not saying a secret. Once, he comes to my office. We had this long conversation. I mean, he had, quite tough problems related, to different things, family, etc., etc. And I mean, obviously, he was feeling the burden of a dramatic moment in his life. And he said, but but anyway, I know that Jesus loves me, so everything is fine. And I tells him, and I just told him, how do you know? he was absolutely scandalized, no? He was shocked, but Father Paolo, you are a priest, how do you dare? I'm coming here for you giving me certainty, not the other way around, no? But then, at a certain point I said, wow, what am I doing? But then I thought, no, that's what I learned. That's what I learned through Father Giussani. No? In other words, I'm not trying to test your faith or to induce you into temptation, but in a certain sense, there was something in him. A sort of, but Jesus loves me was a way of preventing himself from actually allowing himself to accept the charge of law, verifying in his experience, who is this Christ is. Of course, for example, in this case, preventing himself from going through the journey of what does experire mean? Etymologically, experience means passing through fire. Pure in Greek means fire. No, it's this. You know that it's true, but somehow, in order to become yours, no. And Mounier, another quote that Giussani loved a lot, no, was you need to suffer so that the truth did not remain a doctrine, but were born through the flesh. No? It's not a denial of the doctrine. It's not a denial of the truth. Okay? The problem is in a world in which everything, as Giussani used to say, is so against the faith, even it becomes something that passed through the fire of your experience, of your verification. So which facts can you tell me in your life? How are you able to read your life in such a way that you say, yes, it's true, my life is good, it makes sense. No, I'm not saying that, if you're not able to give me a list, then your faith is I'm not talking about a question of measuring, no? And yet, this experience for this friend of mine who grew up in the faith, who was a student of the John Paul II, is a student of the John Paul II Institute, although he's finishing, no? He was educated with this sort of idea, you don't need to ask yourself questions, no? Okay.
I was hoping you'd go on a little longer so I could think of something. How do you know? I'm not quite sure how to answer that except to say that when, I suppose I know when I finally notice the grass growing between the cracks of the sidewalk. By which I mean when I finally, and I don't mean to personalize this, but when you can see what you didn't see before. Father Paolo talked about that earlier. And another way that I would describe that too, what the sidewalk does to the grass is it suffocates it, or it very nearly suffocates it. And when in fact seeing is like breathing in a way. Seeing more is like being able to breathe in this reduced world. And how one knows one has had an experience or undergone the event, I suppose, is when you can see in front of you what previously you could not.
Those were both really great answers.
Because I didn't respond the question of the event, but this would get autobiographical. We cannot also speak about event without getting to the level of a content. No,
I do want to talk about that at some point.
Okay, but for me, if I can tell you, for me, the encounter with you were asking the encounter with Giussani, the encounter with. I know it sounds cheesy, it sounds, you would say Protestant, etc., but at the end of the day, it is what the whole thing is about, is the perception through, and as he was saying, It's this throughness, if you will, no? But it's the perception that you are infinitely loved, that the truth of being is this infinite love, no? That touches you now, and that's also traditionally called grace, no? But that's what the event ultimately is, although this event then radiates and makes you see the whole of reality as a gift. Within, Giussani used to quote Guardini, no? And saying, in the experience of a great love, everything becomes an event in its horizon. No, I think it's a very telling way of not reducing the word love to this sort of thing that gets on your nerves, and I know that.
Oh.
But
I like love.
I see a little bit of grass is sparking out of the sidewalk here. I know you want to see a fuller reality.
I'd like to ask Father Prosperi a question, actually, because I really do struggle to understand this a bit, and because this is a concern for me now. It's funny. I mean, going back through this process, things that we're going through such a difficult time in the church right now, in all different kinds of ways, and in the world, that things look, rereading things now, they look different to me, some, and not just Giussani, but any number of things, than they might have 10 years ago. And this is a question that's sort of, that I was trying to get at in my talk, and I'll ask you. I mean, given that, and I understand everything you say about correspondence, and it's there, and I agree with it, that corresponds to what I was created to be and what is built into the human heart. But even with that, if an event implies this novelty, this discontinuity, this surprise, and if the essence of Christianity is an event, and it implies that, how can Christianity also be a tradition? In other words, how is it possible to be an event and a tradition at the same time? And I don't simply mean that in the kind of banal or super. Here's what's part of what underlies the concern: not just tradition as a set of teachings passed down, but the form that the gift actually takes in history. My very life is given to me both by God and by others. So too is the faith. The eyes by which I apprehend, to a certain extent, are not simply made possible by the event, but they're also the eyes of others. The eyes that have been given to me to see. And I'm concerned about, any language that says or that implies that the only way we have to really think or understand something is the way we are speaking about it now, because it implies a break. It's the point that I made, and I'd like to maybe to hear what you have to say to it.
But I mean, I don't see why this. I think what you said already contains the answer. In other words, the passing of the faith is part of what the event is. I mean, I cannot know. I mean, this event cannot touch me but through, the way in which Giussani has always described in an almost elementary, if you will, apparently childish, but I think beautiful way, what tradition is, again, in that famous talk that he gave when I felt my vocation, recognizing Christ, is, those men pass it on to
and so the importance
the
of the witness.
Generation, and the next generation pass it on to the next generation, and the next generation pass it on to the generation. And then they told my mother, and my mother told me. And he has always said that, without Giussani's mother, there wouldn't be Giussani, there wouldn't be us here. So, this is an intrinsic, constitutive dimension of the event, of the possibility of the event, but on the other hand, which is also a point that Ratzinger makes, this also means it belongs to the concept of tradition, the idea that every generation is new, and so it has to re-happen.
Of course.
That's the point, and every generation lives in a different time, and therefore not only has to re-happen, but in a certain sense, the same thing must and can't but happen in a new way.
Yeah, ever ancient, ever new.
Ever ancient and ever new. And in this sense, it's also true that there can be a way of looking back at Giussani that is nostalgic, and it becomes a form of traditionalism, although maybe shorter, because St. Thomas is 1,000 years ago, but the logic becomes the same. No? And therefore we say, okay, Jesus was the prophet of Giussani. As sometimes some Thomas say, okay, Jesus was the prophet of Thomas, and then the time is over. I mean, I love Thomas. He's the greatest theologian in the history of the church. But there is a problem, an intrinsic problem in the claim, because there is something objectively wrong there, right? I mean, because there has to be an inexhaustibleness in Christ that is superior to any possible, which is the point you were making. Mm-hmm. For me, it's the same for Giussani, so much so that what we receive, he has always said, what you received through me, now is yours, make it fruitful.
Well, in that light, that was an excellent answer to a very complex question. But in that light, everybody in the audience came here tonight because they had some question or some interest in being here. So in the about 10 minutes or so we have left, I did want to see if there were questions from audience members that build on the presentations, that are just pressing questions that you've had that you would like to have us try to respond to. I have, as I mentioned, I've only gotten through 1 or 2 of my original 29 questions, so I've got plenty more. But I did want to see if there were some questions from the audience at this point. Okay, so in the middle, I'm going to go in the middle with the tie.
In a recent document by the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, Placua Deo, they talk to Archbishop Ladaria talks to 2 modern heresies, Neo-Pelagianism and Neo-Gnosticism. But yet in paragraph 8 of it, he says Christianity is not a set of moral laws or just lofty ideals, but it is an event that brings about a new horizon. So the question I guess I have is that he talks about or writes about Neo-Pelagianism and Neo-Gnosticism in a way that is more traditional, that goes back to, say, around the time of Augustine, but is used differently than Pope Francis. So in that sense, meaning is that Pope Francis has used the term Neo-Pelagianism to attack or to rally against the rigidity within our church. So I guess having said that, does that speak?
Sorry, who speaks differently?
Let's try to, can you just try to wrap up with a question that the presenters can answer?
So the question is that Archbishop Ladaria in his document,
Okay, yes.
okay, so he uses or references these concepts, but in a new way, saying that there's this new heresy, but yet it is ancient, and it certainly differs in the way that Pope Francis does it. Does that lay any credibility or reasonability to our faith, or does it make it more confusing?
Well, I have to confess, it's a little late in the semester, and I'm a little behind on my reading. And so I'm only I have not studied these things very closely, but surely, I'm not really quite sure what to say to the question.
Two concepts of neo-Gnosticism, the one of the document of Ladaria and the one of the Exultate. Okay, Gaudete and Exultate.
Yeah. Well,
You can be brief. It's okay. We're running out of time, actually. So.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, it seems to me, I agree with you in the sense that the word neo-Gnosticism is used in 2 different ways in the document and in the Gaudete and Exultate. I read both, although the second very quickly, because in the first, neo-Gnosticism is used in relation more closely, more tightly in relation to what Gnosticism originally is, that is an heresy that has profoundly to deal with the dualism, despising the body, and therefore, everything that Gnosticism meant in the 2nd century. Okay, so, and neo-Gnosticism is used in that sense, and therefore the whole question of theology of the body, etc., etc. Instead, Pope Francis used it in a different context, in speaking about holiness and in speaking about the experience of holy, and more broadly and more generically. In other words, neo-Gnosticism as a form of idealization of knowledge as everything that matters in terms of your path to holiness. In other words, holding to the true doctrine as the only essential thing, no? Which is also a mistake, but in other words, Pope Francis, what Pope Francis, it seems to me, is emphasizing is that knowledge is not enough, which is true. It's a very free, broad understanding of the word Gnosticism. If you wanna put it this way, technically or historically, not fully correct, but that's what it means. I don't see a contradiction between the two.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see, there were some other hands up. Other questions here? Okay, there.
In 1997, I became acquainted with Giussani through Msgr Albacete, who was my teacher. And I don't know if it's so much of a question as a statement, because what I feel right now after listening to you is gratitude and peace. And I think when one encounters Christ, that is the feeling, that is the state of mind that one is left with. And it's mind and life altering. I came here searching for something tonight that I had lost. I thought we lost so many great scholars and thinkers in recent years in our church, but I'm so grateful that we have you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you. Thank you so much. Your question?
the question is when one becomes very grateful and one begins to sense the infinite and the value of life, all life. And one person said to me, "It sounds like you're becoming a Jainist. You're afraid to kill an ant." And is this where it leads us to, that all life becomes so sacred that you don't want to kill an ant, you don't want to kill a mouse, you know?
Thank you.
You are the animal lover. You should take that question.
Thank you so much.
To hold the world in wonder and reverence, I mean, is the primordial disposition in a way, for which we are created and to which we should respond to a reality that just overflows. And that does, in a way, I think, make us, or ought to make us, in a sense, more reflective. I mean, C.S. Lewis said in the Abolition, his final little lecture, when he was calling for a regenerated science, and he said, I can hardly imagine even what it is that I'm asking for, but I can imagine that we wouldn't treat stones and trees the way we now treat humans if some such thing were to come to pass. And I think something of that attitude and disposition is appropriate.
We have time for one final question, and I do ask that it be a question and that it be brief. Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah, good. Okay. I thank you very much for sharing. I agree with what you said, that it is an experience, there is an event in conversion. One of the things that comes to mind is Jesus mission statement, which is, I have not come for the righteous, but for sinners to turn from sinning. When we look at Isaiah's experience with God, the first things out of his mouth was of a conversion nature, woe unto me, a sinner who needs to change. What is the opinion regarding conviction of sin as part of this experience? It's obviously God is love, but at the same token, the element of conviction of sin appears to be throughout the Bible in this area.
I think it's intrinsic to any authentic event or encounter. Woe, I am a man of unclean lips. I mean, to experience something genuinely holy is to be, in a certain sense, convicted or burnt as precisely because you're embraced at the same time.
And I'll just add to that in my own experience that I was referring to in the interviews that I did, people have a conscience. Whether they say they believe in God or they don't, people that I talk to actually like to name what they've done wrong. So there is a conviction that there is right and wrong, even if people don't always have a framework to interpret where they're getting that from. So that convinced me that people have a sense of being convicted by their own sin, even if they've never heard the word sin. But on that note, I wish we could continue the conversation, but I want to just ask you to please join me in thanking our speakers for their excellent presentation. And just a couple of announcements before I let you go. On May 3rd and May 10th, Crossroads is happy to offer discounted performances of The Rainmaker here at the Sheen Center. Details about the play and the discount are in your program. You've also received a little brochure with all the spring 2018 events from Crossroads. The next New York encounter is entitled Something to Start From. The date will be on President's Day weekend, February 15th through 17th, 2019. Details are also in the card in your program. And every week there are groups of people from Communion and Liberation who meet in New York City and the tri-state area to read and study and discuss texts of Father Giussani and other authors. These groups are called Schools of Community. They're open to everybody, free of charge, and no registration is required. If you want to know more about Father Giussani and the life of Communion and Liberation, you show up and see for yourself if it fits your interests, with no obligations. You also have received a card that would provide some more information about Schools of Community. And the recently published official biography of Father Giussani is available on sale at the exit, as well as complimentary copies of last year's Giussani Series transcript. And in case you're not going to read that whole biography, which is rather long, you should not miss the one-page op-ed by David Brooks that was in the New York Times today talking about his visit to Italy and a house founded by members of Communion and Liberation, where he does a great job in 1,000 words telling you something inspiring about Father Giussani and the people and the activities that he inspired. Thank you all for coming tonight.